Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock. I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So on this episode, I speak with Johannes Steenbuch about his 2022 Cascade book entitled Negative Theology, A Short Introduction. Dr. Steenbuch received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Copenhagen with a dissertation on negative theology and ethics in Clement of Alexandria and Gregory of Nyssa. On that note, we'll go ahead and jump over to the interview. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, I am here with Dr. Johannes Steenbuch, author of Negative Theology, A Short Introduction. He's joining from across the pond, so we are in very different time zones, and we're both a little under the weather, but we've made it here. I'm very excited to talk about this book with you, so thanks for coming on, Johannes. As we get started,
Thank you.
of course, could you maybe just share a little bit with our listeners about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thank you, Zachariah. It's very exciting to be with you here from Denmark, Europe, and with you on the other side of the pond, as you put it. My name is Johannes Steenbuch. What am I? I'm a historian of philosophy. That's what I usually say when people ask me. I did my master's and my PhD in philosophy, but my main interest is well, it's in theology. I'm a patristic scholar, basically, and for those who don't know what that means, it means I'm someone who studies the church fathers. So my main area, my academic interest is in early Christianity, the theology and philosophy of the first Christians, those who fought through faith and developed the dogmas. I did my PhD on Clement of Alexandria and Gregory of Nyssa, who I guess are some of the more well-known church fathers from the Greek-speaking area. But I must say I've always also had an interest in contemporary or modern theology. Of course, as someone studying philosophy in Denmark, as I did in Copenhagen, you can't really get around Søren Kierkegaard, our great national philosopher. And so I got into him while I studied philosophy, and his whole idea of faith as paradox and faith as the passion for the uncertain and so on. And that got me also into to some degree into Karl Barth and Karl Barth's dialectical theology, who had a great influence in Danish theology and church life in the 20th century, much more than he did in the States, I think. But then, of course, there's almost 2,000 years between this modern stuff and the ancients. While I did my PhD, I couldn't help think: is there a connection between some of this apophatic negative theology that's going on in Clement of Alexandria and Gregory of Nyssa, and then this much more modern approach that we find in Søren Kierkegaard and Karl Barth? And then I decided to, well, try and find out if there were some possible historical links between these very different expressions of faith as something uncertain and God as something incomprehensible. And I found out that, well, we might say that there is, but of course, it's a long and windy road. And it may be a road that's too long and windy for a short book, like the one I wrote. But I decided, well, let's try to put all this down in a narrative that is somewhat more easily accessible than the literature that we normally find on apophatic theology and negative theology. It's a very inaccessible topic.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's I guess that's a kind of disclaimer, actually, if someone wants to read the book. I do also mention it in the preface. I think that we have to leave something out, and we have to simplify this, and we have to pick out what fits into the narrative in order to connect the dots, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get from the early Christians and their idea of God's incomprehensibility and to the modern notion of dialectical theology and all that.
Yeah.
But I guess we will go deeper into the whole story. But
yeah, absolutely, we will. I'm excited to get into it. Yeah, I will say it is really nice to have it all packed into a short 100-page, very accessibly written book. It's nice to have it packaged in that way, because you can read this in 2 or 3 sittings, which is really nice, just to have kind of a summation, a nice overview of, like you said, a very long and complicated history. Okay, before we get into the book, though, I have to ask you our opening question, which maybe you were revealing it a bit, your answer to it a bit already with some of the folks you were mentioning. But if you could place any 3 thinkers kind of together in a room, and they can be either people who are dead or who are still living, and you could listen into their conversation, who would you choose and why?
I think, well, that's a very tough question to answer. I was thinking, that's a very silly question, because how would I know? I don't know these people personally. But on the other hand, I don't want to be a bore, so of course I want to take a challenge and try to answer your question. And then it struck me that while I obviously don't know the people personally that I write about, I do know them in some sense indirectly through their followers. I mean, when I go to conferences on Clement of Alexandria, I really enjoy being around Clement scholars.
Yeah.
Also, we live in a country, Denmark, where the majority of the population are members of the Lutheran Church. My wife's a Lutheran pastor, and many of my friends are Lutherans and really dig and go into Luther. And I like hanging around them too, of course. And then there are also a gang of Calbartians around in Denmark who I also enjoy hanging around with. So I guess that would be my answer. Clement of Alexandria, Martin Luther, and Karl Barth. I think they would also actually be capable of throwing a good party. Clement wasn't as ascetic as Christians would become in the following centuries. He enjoyed a wine sometimes, some wine. And Luther, of course, is famous for his for drinking the good beer of Wittenberg. And then Karl Barth, I guess, would be the one who could bring the cigars, and I think that would be a fun evening with the company of those 3. Although, of course, especially Luther was quite choleric. I don't know how he would fit with Clement, who seems to be a more moderate spirit.
Sure. No, that sounds like a very fun group. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a very large and difficult question, but obviously you're skillful at condensing this material because of what you've pulled off in this book. But I'm going to ask you to condense it even further. So if you were maybe at a family dinner or something, or you were maybe making small talk with somebody that you just met, and they asked you what you study, and you said negative theology, and they said, what's negative theology?
What's that?
just a few minutes, maybe, what would you say? How would you describe what negative theology is?
Yeah, well, I must admit that I've actually given up using that term when people ask me because they always what's negative theology? A colleague of mine, when I did my PhD, said, what's that? Is it saying that God is stupid or something? Well, being theologically negative. So I usually just say, well, I study the incomprehensibility of God in theological literature, and then I go on to explain. We also call that negative theology because we use negative definitions for God. So describing negative theology in just a few minutes, well, it may not be that hard after all. If we simply define it as a kind of theological discourse that uses well, negative definitions, whether implicit or explicit, about the divine, whatever we mean by that. So saying that God is infinite, God is incomprehensible, God is invisible, ineffable, and so on. All these negative definitions of what God is. That's negative theology. But it's not, and I always make sure to add, it's not something that stands on its own. It's not a competitor to other kinds of theology. It's a side of theology. It's a side of all kinds of theological discourse, whether we admit it or not. I mean, all kinds of theology must have some notion of God's incomprehensibility, or notion of our dealing with some kind of mystery. So all kinds of theology, all theological schools have their own negative theology, whether or not they develop it explicitly. I think does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah, I think one of the things that was impressive, I don't want to say surprising, was in reading your book just how pervasive negative theology, or maybe kind of negative leaning theology, is
Yeah,
throughout the whole course of the tradition.
yeah.
Your book has a lot of different names in it,
Oh yeah.
from all across the 2,000 years of Christian history, and even non-Christian history with some of these Neoplatonic and Jewish thinkers as well. Which maybe let's get into some of the early thinkers. So you mentioned Clement of Alexandria a couple
Yeah,
times
yeah.
already, but who were some of the major players in kind of early ancient negative theology? And then what was kind of the flavor of this negative theology that was developing in the early years with
Yeah,
these few groups, right? We have like the Neoplatonists, and then we have kind of
yeah.
these early Christian thinkers, and then we have some Jewish figures who are also doing similar stuff. So what's kind of the makeup of the negative theology during this early period?
Yeah. So to start with, I would say that, as I already indicated, I think we could say that most, if not all, religious traditions worldwide has some sense of mysteriousness or incomprehensibility of most fundamental reality. But when we talk about negative theology as a tradition, we almost always use that term as a tradition that goes back to Jewish, Christian, and Hellenic sources, and those sources are more or less in the first century. Some would say that, well, it goes all the way back to the earliest of Greek philosophy, and it may do to some degree, but as an explicit way of dealing with this discourse about God, we see it developed in the first century with maybe Philo of Alexandria is the first one, a Jewish philosopher. He was called by Andrew Louth the father of negative theology, because he tried to, as a Jewish scholar who lived in Alexandria, which was a very eclectic religiously and philosophically environment or milieu, he tried to, well, basically read the Hebrew scriptures through the lens of philosophy, trying to read out philosophical truths by studying the prophets and the law and so on. And what Philo of Alexandria, what he focuses on, especially what's important to him in his development of negative theology, is the story of Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses, who first meets God in the burning bush, and who asks God to tell his name, and God says, I am who I am, or as it's translated in the Septuagint, the Greek translation that Philo used, I am he who is, or being itself, as Philo understood it. And as being itself, God is in some sense incomprehensible, because we can't get around being itself. We can get beyond being itself. If being itself is the first principle, then we can't get above it, so to speak. And that's what Moses had to learn on Mount Sinai, when he had to enter the dark cloud, and then the thick darkness, as it's sometimes translated on Mount Sinai. This gnophos, as it's called in Greek, the thick darkness. It's almost like a kind of darkness that's feasible. It's you can feel the darkness. I think that's the idea, that Moses had to enter this darkness in order to meet God. And says Philo of Alexandria, this is because God is basically incomprehensible and ineffable. Ineffable is, I think it's an old, maybe a kind of archaic word in English, isn't it?
Yeah.
We might say unsayable instead, but it has this certain mystical feel to it, doesn't it? I think for Philo, the idea of talking about God as ineffable is that you cannot take God in your mouth, so to speak. You cannot contain God in language. Of course, the ancient ideas of language were quite different than our modern ideas. Words weren't just neutral sounds or letters that refers to things outside them. But when you try to name God, and of course you shouldn't, according to the Hebrew tradition, say the name of God, then you in some way try to keep God in your mouth, and of course you can't do that, because God is much more than what can be contained by any human attempt to comprehend God. Also, terms like when we say that God is incomprehensible, it simply means that we cannot grasp God with our hands, and then with our language, and with our mind. And so for Philo of Alexandria, this is really the basis of negative theology, the story about Moses and his experiences of God, who is being itself and can as such not be named or spoken or comprehended by the human mind. And of course, ideas such as these are present elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures. We hear about God, who is a God who hides himself in Isaiah, and in the book of Job. We also hear this. I think it's Elihu who says that the Almighty we can't grasp the Almighty. We don't find the Almighty. And then in the New Testament, there was similar ideas, especially the invisibility of God is stressed in some parts of the New Testament. I especially like the quote from the first epistle of John, where the author says that, no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God we know God, or God is in us, and so on. So God is invisible, but in some sense we know God through love, and that's an important point in the early Christian tradition. Whereas I think Philo had maybe a more speculative point than in the early Christian tradition in the New Testament. Well, then the point is that we don't know God in a theoretical manner, but we know God in practice. So that's an ethical point to making these negative theological claims about the invisibility or incomprehensibility of God. So we're not capable of making theories about God, but we know God when we love each other. Well, basically because God is love. Yeah. That's what I find in the early Christian tradition. But then these ideas from Philo of Alexandria was taken up by the early Christians, early Christian apologists, when they were entering new territory, when they entered Roman Greek culture, so influenced by Greek philosophy, and had to take up philosophical tools basically in order to develop a theology that made some kind of theoretical sense or intellectual sense in order to answer critics, or simply in order to being capable of putting into words what is the gospel, what is this strange idea of God having become human in Jesus. And some of them from early on took up this idea of God's ineffability that we find in Philo of Alexandria. Someone like Justin Martyr, for example, in one of his apologies he writes in the 2nd century. Well, he says that God is incomprehensible and God is ineffable and so on, using basically the same arguments as Philo had done. Well, Justin says at one point, if someone names something, he's basically the father or the elder of that thing. But because God is the father of all, then we can't name God, because we would make ourselves the father or elder of God in that way. And of course, he's talking in an ontological or epistemological sense, not historical sense, because as we know, Adam was created according to Genesis after the animals, but he could name them anyway. They were not, of course, the elders of Adam, but Adam had some sort of authority over the animals when he named them, didn't he? I think that's also the point in Justin and also Philo. But as human beings, we can't have authority over God, and as such, we can't name God. We can't make a name for God. We can't even make a name for ourselves, as the story about the Tower of Babel reminds us. And so that was one point that Justin made, and he made it in order to distinguish Christian theology or the Christian beliefs from pagan religion, basically. So there's a very often in the early apologists, like Justin Martyr, there's a very polemical point to it. So he's basically saying, well, God is beyond everything that we can understand and imagine, because he's the first principle that we can't get beyond. But that must also mean that all the statues and stuff that you worship like idols must be, well, they can't really be expressions of the true God, because that would make God comprehensible. That would make God to be in our control. That is a point that's made by many of the early Christian apologists, like the Epistle to Diognetus, and Aristides of Athens also has this point. They also say that God doesn't need anything. That's also a negative definition of God. God is perfect, and that's the positive definition. And then there's this negative definition. God is without needs, and that must mean surely that God doesn't need our sacrifices and so on. I think that's also a point that Paul makes according to through Acts 17, his famous sermon or speech at the Areopagus in Athens, where I, by the way, just went last week.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. It's very beautiful there, and they have this big plaque, or what do you call it, with the sermon in Greek, where Paul says, citizens of Athens, I see that you are very religious, according to, depending on translation, religious or superstitious. I see you worship the unknown God, because I found altars saying that. And then, of course, Paul comes and proclaims this God to them. And doing that, he according to the two Acts, he also quotes a few Greek philosophers, and that really gives a connection between this fundamentally negative theological apophatic idea of the unknown God, and then the use of Greek philosophy in order to make points about Christian theology. That's already there in the New Testament, and that became useful, of course, for early Christian apologists who wanted to use stuff like Philo's philosophy, and also the philosophy of someone like Plato, in order to explain what is the gospel, what is Christianity about. And so, well, that was the long story about we only got into the first or second century.
Yeah.
And but let's make the next few points a bit shorter, because I think you also asked me about the Neoplatonists. Where do they fit in?
Right.
And that's an important question, because often we get the impression often we are told in histories of theology and philosophy, well, basically these kinds of speculative theology and especially negative theology got into Christianity through Neoplatonism, and that's true to some extent. But as I've explained now, actually the sources are more probably in Jewish philosophy, and the early Christians was inspired by that. And there are some indications that perhaps also Platonic philosophers in Alexandria in the 1st and 2nd century might have been inspired by Philo of Alexandria. At least they took up this idea of God's ineffability, saying that God is ineffable, aritos. We find that in some Platonic non-Christian authors in the centuries after Philo. Of course, it's not easy to say who invented this this way of thinking and so on, but I think it's fair to say that Alexandria was like much of the Roman Empire an eclectic milieu. It was so in religious terms, but also philosophical terms. So saying that, well, this all comes from Neoplatonism, or it all comes from Jewish philosophy, I think that's a wrong approach. But it all starts around this time, and there are different versions of it according to what use you want to make of it, and that's maybe the most important point that I want to make. Negative theology rarely is an aim in itself. At this point, we don't see theologians or philosophers just simply engaging in negative theology, discussing how can we talk about God in purely negative terms. No, they always have a purpose. As the Christian apologist, well, the purpose was to defend the gospel. For Neoplatonists, the purpose was different. Of course, Plotinus is the famous Neoplatonist who's said to be the founder of the Neoplatonist school. And so what is Neoplatonism? Well, it's basically an attempt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to make some systematic sense of Plato's philosophy. And Plotinus did that by taking basically Plato's dialogue Parmenides and making that central to his system. Well, in the Parmenides, the Eleatic philosopher Parmenides talks about the one that is as being the one without parts and so on, and being without parts, it must be infinite, and it must be without being, it must be eternal, and so on. And Plotinus says, well, this is the fundamental principle of all reality. I don't think that was the point that Plato was making. It was more simply an experiment about thinking about what does it mean for something to be one. But Plotinus made this the basis of his whole system, that the source of all reality is beyond being. It's incomprehensible, and it's infinite, and so on. It cannot be thought through or comprehended because it's without parts, and for something to be comprehended, it must have parts. But of course, from this first principle, all of reality emanates in some way, and here we are in material reality, and our aim, ethical aim, so to speak, must be to return to the one in some sense, become one with the one, or to become one ourselves through this process of henosis, so-called becoming one. Of course, we also see similar thoughts in early Christian philosophy already in the 2nd century, which is basically the generation before Plotinus, and I find that interesting again because of this saying something about, well, we don't have just simply one school of Neoplatonism and then the Christians on the other hand, but already in Clement of Alexandria, we see this idea of God as the one to him, being not fundamental to his system. That would be saying too much, but he does play around with this idea of God as the first principle, as we already heard with Philo and Justin, must be incomprehensible. And Clement says, well, that's because the one is without parts, it's infinite, it cannot be comprehended, it's without dimensions, and so on, and we cannot even probably call it being, at least not in the sense that we normally call it being. But of course, that makes this kind of thing a bit problematic, because going back to the story of Moses, well, didn't we say that God is being itself? Well, it was for Philo, and that was the whole point of his way of thinking through theology. But then for this more Neoplatonic approach, God is in some way even beyond being, though being the source of being, of course. And that was also a point that's made by using a quote from Plato's Republic, where Socrates says something like, well, the good is beyond being. And of course, if we say, well, the good and the one is identical, and we can call it God and so on, then well, the source of everything good, everything that is, must be beyond, in some sense, whatever that means. And that becomes a great discussion in negative theology afterwards. But this Neoplatonic idea only later becomes a part of the Christian discourse. I would say it's only in the 4th century and almost that it really has an impact. I think that we could say that the Christians, following Philo and the biblical sources, developed their own negative theology to start with, again revolving around this story of Moses and his experiences in the thick darkness on the mountain.
Okay, so we have several figures really in the first 2 or 3 centuries that you've mentioned.
Yeah,
we have
yeah.
we have
We have more,
Philo,
right?
yeah, and even more than you've mentioned. And then we have kind of these Christian apologists and Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Neoplatonists like Plotinus, and then you kind of moving into the 4th century, which you were just starting to get into. I think we have the Cappadocians. So
Yeah.
how did all of this? You were, it almost sounded like you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's almost a new expression of Christian negative theology with the Cappadocians being influenced maybe more so by the Neoplatonists than earlier Christian negative theologians were. So how did all of this kind of coalesce with these Cappadocians? And then were there any kind of newer distinctive developments that they were offering as opposed to the earlier figures?
Yeah. That's a good question, and again, it depends on the perspective and the instrumental or the use of negative theology. I would say, what were the purpose? What were they trying to say? So maybe it's true that they take up ideas from Neoplatonic thought, but again, what is the purpose of doing so? I think I should add that when Clement of Alexandria made these points about God being incomprehensible and the one and infinite and so on, he adds to this thought experiment, as I would almost call it, that what Moses learned when going up on the mountain was that God can only be known by his own power. And that's the point of doing negative theology, according to Clement, in this context. Often we take Clement's ideas out of context, but he adds that what Moses learned was that God can only be known through revelation, the grace of revelation. It was not without the wood of the tree that he came to our knowledge, says Clement. And I think now we go to the Cappadocians. To a large degree, the same point is crucial to the Cappadocian use of negative theology. Even if they develop negative theology in quite distinct new terms, because they're in a basically a Christian setting where most of at least much of their theology is developed in defense of, at that time, Nicene orthodoxy. Well, then that's the whole point of their excesses into speculative negative theology. It's a defense of Christian orthodoxy. So much of what Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian theologians, what he develops, much of what he develops in terms of negative theology is in his polemical engagement with another theologian called Eunomius. There's a big debate going on there. It becomes very technical, but basically Eunomius' claim was that the Father, God the Father, being unborn or ungenerate, must be essentially different from the Son who is born and generate. And that is because, according to Eunomius, at this point in the latter part of the 4th century, according to Eunomius, when we say something about God, well, we say something always about God's essence. When we say that God the Father is unborn, well, we say that God the Father is essentially unborn. And when we say that God the Son is born, then we say that God the Son is essentially born. And because of that, said Eunomius, the two cannot essentially be the same, or they cannot be of the same essence as the Nicene Creed puts it. The Nicene Creed from 325, as it was formulated in Nicaea. Well, the basics of Trinitarian theology is that the God the Son is of the same essence of the Father's essence. So they have the same essence, but as the Cappadocians would say, they are different hypostases, different persons. But then how can we defend that view if our language describes the essence of God as Eunomius believed? Well, it doesn't, says Gregory of Nyssa. When we say that God the Father is unborn and that God the Son is born, we don't describe the essence of God. We describe their relationship, as that is the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. So words that we use for God are relational. They do not comprehend in any way God's ineffable essence. And in order to make this point very clearly, that the words that we use for God cannot be about God's essence, then Gregory had to develop a quite clear negative theology. And he does that by insisting on God's infinity. the infinity of God. So we've already heard that in someone like Clement of Alexandria and the Neoplatonists, there were ideas about, to some degree, about God's infinity. But depending on whose scholar you ask, it makes sense to say that in Gregory, the notion of God's infinity becomes at least much more central than it was before. Before, it might only have been an apophatic notion, saying that, God is infinite means that we can't really grasp God because there's no final, there's no edges of God, so to speak, that we can put our hands on. But to Gregory, God's infinity is much more fundamental. It's because, as he says in his important book, The Life of Moses, one of his later works, again, Moses, God is infinitely good. There's no internal limit to God's goodness. And really, there's no external limit either, because as was also a common idea at this point, evil is only the privation of good. So there might be a privation of good in the world, but as the good as such is not limited in any way. God is infinitely good, and for this reason cannot be comprehended. And so it's not so the basis of Gregory's negative theology is this idea of divine infinity, which is not a negative idea as such. It's a rather positive idea in a sense. Although we can't define it, we can only define God's infinite goodness in negative terms. We can say that it's infinite. We can say that it's incomprehensible, and we can say that it's invisible. But it is something positive in a moral sense, or what we might say. That's why Gregory can also delve into these paradoxical formulation. He talks about the luminous darkness of God.
Yeah.
The darkness that almost shines, or it shines in such a way that we're blinded and cannot see. And that's again what Moses experiences on the mountain. So for someone like Gregory, this is also a very important story. It's a biblical narrative that establishes negative theology. It's based on a story. It's not based on a speculative notion of God. What Moses experiences on the mountain when he has to enter the thick darkness again is that God is infinite and cannot be comprehended. So that's an important point that Gregory then adds, that he's become famous for. Then there's always more to grasp. There's always more to know about God. Because God is infinite and we're finite, that's very simple. There's always more. We can always grow in our relation to the good. The good is an infinite source. God is an infinite source of goodness. And of course, I think it's important now, I said before, that what's the use of negative theology? Why do they say that and these things about God? And for Gregory, in the debate with Eunomius, the point was to establish the orthodoxy of the Nicene belief in the divinity of Christ. Christ is God. That was the point of all this negative theology in the debate with the Eunomius. But then in Gregory's book on Moses, I think that actually what is sometimes overlooked is that he's making a similar point. He's not just saying that, putting Christology aside, we can, like Moses, have this mystical experience of God's luminous darkness as we dive into God and so on. No, because he adds that in the story about Moses who goes into the thick darkness, there is this point that at one point Moses asks God to show himself, to show his face. Moses says to God, show me your face. And of course, God says, well, no one can see my face and live. So Moses is not allowed to see God's face. But Moses gets to stand in a cleft in a rock where he can sit neatly. And And then God walks by, according to the story in Exodus, he walks by Moses up there on the mountain. And as God walks by, he puts his hand over the cleft so that Moses can't see anything. And then as God has walked by, he lifts his hand, and then Moses gets to see God from behind. So Moses doesn't get to see the face of God, but he gets to see the back parts of God, so to speak. And already Philo had some observations about the meaning of this, but Gregory takes this to mean that, well, God can only be known by following God. We follow God as we follow the Word of God, and the Word of God is, of course, Jesus Christ. So what Moses learns on the mountain is that, well, first of all, because God is infinite, we cannot comprehend God, but then we can have a relationship to God by following the incarnate Word in Christ. And so I think that Gregory's point in this book on the life of Moses is also basically, to some degree, to establish Christological orthodoxy. Christ is God, and he's the one that we are to follow. So it's the same point as in the debate with Eunomius.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna make some jumps in time that I imagine will probably be a little painful for someone who's a historian of philosophy like you are. In fact, the jumps will get bigger maybe as we move along. But I want to talk about Dionysius, the Areopagite, or Pseudo Dionysius, as he's sometimes called. I think, in my experience at least, when I think of negative theology, he's probably the first name that comes to mind. So why? And obviously he's, for most people, a huge figure in the negative theology canon. So why is his place in that canon so important? And we could, I'll let you talk about really whatever you want to draw out with Dionysius. But if you want to talk about like his distinction between negative and positive theology, that would be great. Or maybe the kind of 3 steps of the spiritual life that he lays out. But I'll leave it up to you what you want to draw out, like I said.
Yeah, and we'll see if we have time to get into the whole modern stuff. But let's start with Dionysius. You know, he's very famous in Athens. They are all crazy about, well, maybe not all, but there's a lot of Dionysius stuff going on in Athens. He has a big road called after him, and many churches are called after Dionysius the Areopagite. And so he was hugely influential in the Middle Ages, both in the Latin West and in the Greek-speaking Eastern Orthodox Church. So we don't exactly know who this guy is, but he wrote in the 5th or 6th century, and he's called or named after Dionysius, whom Paul met when he went to the Areopagus, as we talked about before, and when Paul made this speech, according to Acts 17, there were some converts apparently to Christianity, and one of those were named Dionysius. And so in the 6th century, some guy writes in with this name. So it's a pseudonymous work. We don't know who really wrote it. There are speculations that it might have been a Syrian monk, and that he might have been influenced by the Neoplatonist Proclus, Proclus again of Athens, who was the last great Neoplatonist or head of the Platonic Academy in Athens. And he developed the ideas from Plotinus that then Dionysius took up. And again, Dionysius, as a Christian, applies the ideas from Neoplatonism on the narrative of Moses. He has a small book called Mystical Theology that starts by a prayer to the Trinity, where Dionysius says, so the Trinity beyond everything, beyond being, beyond comprehension, and so on. And then he goes into discussing how is it that we experience God. And this is what we learn from Moses, that entering the thick darkness or the darkness of unknowing, as Dionysius is famous for calling it, the darkness of unknowing or ignorance. This is where Moses meets God. And of course, Dionysius is clear to explain that. I think it's in his book on the divine names that this kind of ignorance is, of course, not the ignorance of the bad kind. It's not the lack of knowledge, but it's a kind of knowledge that exceeds knowledge. It's an ignorance that's beyond what can be known. So we move beyond what we know about God as we enter this darkness of unknowing. And how do we do that? Well, Dionysius has this method where he develops a more radical negative theology than what we've heard of until now. So according to someone like Gregory of Nyssa, God can be defined as infinite and incomprehensible and so on, in distinction to what is comprehensible and what is finite. But then Dionysius adds that, well, that's not enough. We need to go a step further. We can't just end up saying, well, God is infinite, God is incomprehensible. We also need to say that God is beyond what is incomprehensible. God is beyond infinite, in order that we not end up thinking that our negative definitions of God are then good enough. Because then we would think that we had, well, now finally, now I have a theoretical notion of God because I can define God in negative terms. No, that you can't do that. We have to go even further. So we have to say that God is hyper. He uses this prefix a lot. Hyper good, hyper being, hyper, and so on. God is beyond everything, and that's to say that well, we need even to negate our negative theology. And so God is not being, God is not non-being, God is beyond being. God is the source of both being and non-being in some sense. And this whole approach to negative theology, shaped by Neoplatonic thought, becomes very influential in the Middle Ages. In the West, as Dionysius is translated into Latin by John Scotus Eriugena in Britain. And then as this tradition is taken up also in mystical theology in the Middle Ages, in Meister Eckhart and people like these. But also someone like Thomas Aquinas was very influenced by Dionysius. Thomas Aquinas is often thought of primarily as an Aristotelian theologian, but he actually quotes Dionysius much more. And it's basically in Thomas that we find this idea of 3 steps. It's not so much in Dionysius himself, but Thomas tries to make it more systematic by saying, well, first we have affirmation, we say that God is being, for example. Then we have negation, we say that God is not being, not in the sense that beings have being, at least. And then eminence, this hyper thing. God is hyper being. But Thomas, of course, is more moderate. He doesn't say that God is perhaps even some nothing beyond being. Well, God is being, the source of being, as Philo and the others learned from reading the Septuagint translation of God's self-description. But God is not being in the same sense as beings have being. So there's an idea of analogical language being developed here in Thomas, using this methodology from Dionysius, that, well, we can use our everyday words when we describe God, but we must know that they don't mean the exact same thing as they do normally.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're gonna keep kind of moving through the narrative here, and we're gonna skip over some more figures like Erigena and Maimonides. Maybe we'll have to come back for part 2 to discuss some of the modern figures. But for today, let's close out by talking about Meister Eckhart. I think we need to make sure not to skip over Meister Eckhart. So in what ways does he kind of further radicalize negative theology? And then also another question is, like, why do you think Eckhart and his theological legacy have kind of always been controversial, it seems? Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah.
But why is he even still kind of controversial today?
Yeah. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think that basically there was a lot of new theological and ecclesiastic movements going on in the latter part of the Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th century, and sometimes they had some pretty radical ideas. Meister Eckhart, he was a German Dominican scholar, I think, and he wrote at a time, preached at a time when there was already some sort of, you could say, call it this lay awakening going on with the figures like Marguerite Porete, and I think she was a nun, and she wrote a book on this. What's it name? It's named the Mirror of Simple. No, I need to look it up.
The Mirror of
The
you had it
Mirror of
right. The
Simple
Mirror of
Souls.
Simple
Yeah.
Souls. Yeah.
And there we find some pretty radical claims saying that God is basically beyond virtue, and God cannot be. We can't find God. Well, she describes God as a pure nothingness without thought. She says. So we can only know God or love God or praise God insofar that we admit that we can't love God. We're quite unable to love God. Maybe that's an Augustinian point about, well, the need for radical grace, but there's also a Neoplatonic element in it. At some point she says, I have said that I will love him. I lie, for I am not. It is he alone who loves me. I am not. And this whole idea of nothingness is a prevalent theme in Neoplatonic theology. Well, basically, God is beyond being and in a sense nothing. Eriugena, Dionysius' Latin translator, described God as non-being by eminence. God is, in distinction to evil, of course, which is non-being by privation. Then God is non-being by being beyond being. But that risks ending up in some quite radical claims about God being, in a sense, nothing. God is not, we might say. And as we enter the late Middle Ages, we also see that the more classical Platonic notion of participatory ontology, where everything that exists in some way participate in the being of God, who is being itself, that dissolves to some degree in the nominalism of William F. Ockham and similar strains of thought, where well, basically the only thing that really exists are individuals, and they can relate in some ways, but concepts like being are more, it's general concepts that we use to group these individual beings. And then in Meister Eckhart, if that's the case, then if God is something, then basically human beings must be nothing. Or conversely, if human beings are something, then God must be nothing. And so in order to have a relation to God, it's not simply a Platonic idea of participation. That doesn't work anymore. So in order to have a relation to this God that is in some sense nothing, then we need to become nothing ourselves. He says at one point we need to dive into as out of something and into nothing. I think that's how he formulates it, into this nothingness of God. And he has this radical idea about a whole concept of God as something that we need to be freed from. He has a prayer where he says, he has a prayer to God, of course, where he says, God, free us from God. And so basically what's going on here is that Eckhart says that all our attempts at relating to God through ways, as he says, through practices, through ideas, through even morals and so on, through our willing to do the will of God, all this is basically our attempts at making up a God that becomes an idol. I think that's his idea. And to reach the God that is beyond this idol that we put up, this idol has to be broken down, and only God can do that. And so we need to pray to God that all our attempts at figuring out God are really done away with. Yeah, and that becomes very radical, because does that mean that if God cannot be found in ways, as he says at some point, then does this mean that there can be no such thing as Christian morality? That seems to be the point, or at least it seems to have been the interpretation that was made by some of his contemporaries. There was libertinistic groups that really wanted to do away with Christian morality, maybe what they really wanted to do away with was the ecclesiastical hierarchy and so on. There was a proto-reformatory criticism of the whole system of the church and so on, which of course doesn't really make any sense if God can only be known as this nothing that we have to dissolve into by moving beyond all our ideas of God. And where Eckhart also becomes radical is where he says that, well, love is not the highest virtue. That's where I think that he really goes too far. I mentioned the quote from First John that I like, where the author says that, well, no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, we know God, and so on. So we know God through love. But then Meister Eckhart says, well, God is not the highest virtue, because the highest virtue must be detachment, detachment from everything. And love still has a detachment to the thing that's loved, because it's about relations, of course. But God can only be known through detachment, because God is detached from everything. And so in order to become this nothingness of God, we have to really remove ourselves from everything. And that's a very Neoplatonic notion of abstraction, or abstracting oneself from one's surrounding in order to become one, as the Neoplatonists say, or in order to become this one with this divine nothing, as the thought goes in Eckartian terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think this is a good place for us to wrap up for today. At least it's been very, very rich conversation. But thank you again for taking the
Thank
time
you.
today. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
That's good. I did too.